So let's start where most nonprofit conversations always start, which is with the mission. And sometimes even just going back to this basic point is a good way to start and respond to any of these questions in some ways, because part of it is it's your chance. They may ask you a question about something over here, but they may not understand your mission or who you are or how you're structured. And so I always feel like the board chair especially, but really all board members need to have a good working knowledge of the mission to be able to explain it. For family foundations, that often begins with making sure you have a clear picture of donor intent, which is never as clear as anyone thinks it is, whether you're the person who started the foundation and think it's absolutely perfectly clear, or it's 3 or 4 generations later and everyone thinks they have an interpretation of what mom and dad or grandma and grandpa wanted, and they're all different definitions. And so I think one of the things to never underestimate is the power of having some conversations, especially if you're bringing in new board members, about what is the mission and the donor intent, and to really just sort of literally, sometimes as simple as go around the table and ask, what does it mean to you? What do you think it is? So you as board chair can facilitate a conversation that says, does everyone, how far apart is everyone? How close are they? Where are the common denominators and where's the commonality and where are their differences of opinion? To sort of realize that it needs to be refreshed, and that in some ways that's often what brings people together and gets board members excited. How do you know if you're a board member and you're making a difference, or I don't feel needed? Well, if you don't have a chance to connect to the mission, it's almost going to be impossible to feel valued and feel like you're making a difference on the board. I think someone asked, you know, if you're in the elevator and you have 30 seconds, well, I always think one of the things that every nonprofit and every board chair of any organization needs to be able to do is give the 30-second elevator speech or barbecue speech that says, this is what our foundation does. And it doesn't have to be memorized, but you need to be able to get straight to the heart of sort of what causes you care about, what communities you're serving, what problems you're addressing, to someone who knows nothing about charities and foundations and philanthropy. Sort of assume that you have a relatively ignorant audience in this point, because you just never know what someone's assumptions are, to sort of start at the very basic. And again, exercises with the board just to talk about that can really help, whether it's role playing, whether it's really sort of saying, being very intentional when, you know, recommending that board members next time they're at a cocktail party that they find one opportunity to explain the foundation to someone and see what conversations ensue. The other thing that people often do is they spend a lot of time at board meetings looking at financials and doing grant approvals, but never bringing it back to how does this support our mission? How does this further our cause? And to sort of not lose sight of that as whether it's as simple as putting your mission statement or your purpose or something sort of on your meeting agenda, because the best board meetings I've been in, at some point someone will say, oh, and that makes sense because here's what our mission statement said, or we've been doing this for 20 years and we want to keep doing it, and they tie it back to the mission, not just because they're checking off a litany of things to do in a meeting. So as board chair, your goal is to make sure that the mission is somewhere on that agenda and gets discussed. Ideally at every meeting, but that you also set aside time each year to sort of have a conversation that's perhaps a little more free-flowing than a decision-making agenda item, to make sure everyone on the board can sort of really articulate the same vision for the foundation. You don't want one person, and this is with all due respect to a friend in the room, saying, well, our foundation really supports the arts, and someone else on the board saying, well, we really support social services. You want to make sure that you've got a common language to describe what the foundation does. As board chair, you have a little bit of the tough task of being the rule enforcer, perhaps, and making sure the rules get written for what your grant making is. So it's really to guide the grant making strategy. This isn't to decide where all the grants go, you know, as board chair, that's not your job, but to make sure you have the rules in place and the guidelines and the strategies. And sometimes that's very clear. If you're just starting out, you can sort of be more intentional about it. You're already at this conference, so you're thinking this way. For other people, it's, you know, you wake up 20 years later and you say, gosh, we've been doing this for 20 years, what have we done? And you start to look back, and I had one client that sort of realized that they had gotten in this habit of funding technology. They never set out to do that. They used to be a bricks and mortar, but they realized over time that they really that they were funding, that the new bricks and mortar they did schools, was not necessarily buildings anymore, but it was making sure the schools had the technology and the infrastructure for teachers. But it was sort of this sort of retrospective saying we really are willing to sort of put a lot more money into technology than we ever thought we were. So it's setting up some of those guidelines. And it's being intentional about what you fund. I always think that we can all give personal checks of varying sizes, but as a foundation, you can make a bigger impact. You have more concentrated dollars. When you give, other funders may follow, other individual donors may follow. And so to be really intentional about what you're trying to fund and try to leverage those opportunities, whether it's by bigger dollars, by other funders, by collaborating with other organizations in the community. And the second part of this is really putting processes in place so that you have really clear guidelines for your grantees, that you have sort of commitments to respond to folks in certain periods of time, that you say what kinds of, what size grants. Is it going to be general operating? Is it going to be only special programs? Can they expect to receive money for multiple years, or is it 1 or 2 years only? To really sort of think about, be very intentional and thoughtful about what kinds of grants you're willing to make. And then to periodically review that and rethink it, which gets into strategic planning. So the third responsibility of the foundation board chair is to do strategic planning, to facilitate the process. You don't have to go home and sit and write the strategic plan by yourself. It should definitely be a collaborative process and activity. It's something that I think foundations are waking up to. Some have been doing this for a long time. Some have been doing it de facto or implicitly, but not necessarily explicitly in terms of how they think about their grant making. But this is really looking at and not just reaffirming your mission and vision and values, but that should always be the first step in a strategic planning process. But this is really looking at the internal needs and issues that the foundation's facing. What generation are you in? How much community support do you have if you're a community foundation? What's the balance of your staff spent on administrative issues or relations with grantees, and the external environment? What's happening in the communities or the areas you fund, and what do they need? And is it different than what they might have needed 5, 10, 20 years ago? In this environment, what's going to happen for the next couple of years? And what do you want your role as a foundation to be during downtimes in the economy? Really sort of talking about some of those things. So really looking outside your foundation and your own interests, but sort of getting feedback from grantees, from other community leaders, coming to events like this so you really know what's going on in a much bigger way. And then sort of going back and setting goals and priorities. Does it mean you fund everything you've always funded before? Do you start to narrow your focus? Do you fund different kinds of things? Do you do more capacity building or more education for staff? Or do you focus on, if it was K through 12, do you now say K through 16? The conversation we had this morning, at least our round table was sort of the, education doesn't stop at high school, and how do you extend that? So really sort of looking at some of the assumptions you've always held and saying, are they still valid, and how are we going to take that going forward? And then really sort of taking those ideas that are very big and lofty and saying, what does that mean for next year? What does that mean for the next 3 years? How are we going to go from where we are to where we want to be? So it goes back to that strategic planning, which is what kind of staff do you need? What kind of communications with your grantees? What expectations do you set? All of those things fall into sort of a strategic plan, and an operating plan says we're not going to do this for everyone, we're going to do it for select grantees. And then, of course, the next challenge is to say, we've got the strategic plan, we have our annual operating plan for the year, this is what's going to guide us, and how are we going to know it succeeded? What are you going to look at a year from now and say, this worked? Or we set out to do X and we ended up doing Y. So coming up with a way to monitor your progress. It's not quite a report card, but in some ways it's just sort of your own self, end of the year evaluation, and finding a way to say, did this work?